Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Naseem Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you for joining us again, Mouin.
Thank you, Naseem. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
So on today's show, we'll be discussing the grim situation in Rafah, Egypt's preparation for Palestinian refugees in anticipation of an Israeli assault on Rafah. I'll be asking, is this the ethnic cleansing we've all been fearing? So-called Israeli moderates object to a two-state solution. Where does that leave Washington and Israel's allies, who are counting on an alternative to Netanyahu to rescue the Zionist project? One of the right-wing members of Netanyahu's coalition has announced that he will prevent Palestinians from worshipping in Masjid al-Aqsa during Ramadan. So that's going to escalate situations, of course, in the West Bank. We'll also be discussing Israel's escalation in Lebanon, asking if the aim is to create a buffer zone in southern Lebanon. And we'll try to offer an answer to the nagging question over why the US refuses to use any leverage, especially on Israel, that is, especially given reports of there being strong disagreements between Biden and Netanyahu, and more, of course, we will have on this show. So let's begin with Gaza itself. The week has been dominated by Israel declaring its plan to launch a ground invasion of Rafah. Bear in mind, Rafah is where nearly 1.5 million Palestinian refugees Palestinians have been herded on the assumption that it is a safe zone, Israel claimed at the beginning. Yesterday, Israeli War Cabinet member Benny Gantz, he said that the operation will be launched by 10th of March, which coincides with the beginning of the holy month of Ramadan. So let's begin by getting your thoughts on that, on what's happening in Rafah and the announcement that will begin on the day Ramadan starts.
Well, I think there's two things going on here. I think in the short term, Israel failed to crush Hamas in the northern Gaza Strip. It failed to crush Hamas in the center of the Gaza Strip, and it has failed to crush Hamas in Khan Yunis. So it's now moving its focus gradually to the far south of the Gaza Strip, Rafah, the town and refugee camp, and its environs, which border Egypt. And I think at this stage, probably Israel's military planners and their sponsors in Washington and London and elsewhere in Europe have probably come to the conclusion that Israel cannot do more than perhaps significantly degrade Hamas's military capabilities. And therefore, they will now move into Rafah and try to achieve something similar to elsewhere in the Gaza Strip, which again, judging most recently by the assessment of Senator Warner of the U.S. Senate Foreign Intelligence Committee, is rather paltry in terms of achievement. So there's that, let's say, narrow military dimension. But of course, Israel's campaign against the Gaza Strip has much broader aims than simply taking on and seeking to defeat Hamas. From the very beginning, Israeli leaders, military, civilian, political, and opinion makers and others have indicated very clearly that death and destruction are for them strategic objectives. In other words, they plan to raise the Gaza Strip to the ground. And we've seen that elsewhere, where Israel, when it establishes control over a certain area, the demolition crews go in and begin systematically demolishing buildings, structures, schools, mosques, hospitals, and the like. And this is something they haven't yet achieved to a significant extent in Rafah. Secondly, and I think at least as importantly, is this continuing intention to drive the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip into either the sea or the desert, in this case, Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. And this, of course, has all kinds of complications for Egyptian-Israeli relations. But I think Israel's intention, if it does indeed conduct a wide-scale operation into Rafah, will be essentially to force the Palestinians into Egypt's Sinai desert. Now, to what extent they will succeed in that, I think, remains an open question. But when you look at these terror bombings, sniping of civilians, men, women, and children, seeking to access desperately needed food and other forms of aid and so on, I think it's fair to say that Israel has a very clear plan about what it intends to achieve with respect to the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. As you mentioned, they've essentially been herded into the southwest of the Gaza Strip, and the next step would be to force them across the border into Egypt.
At the beginning, Egypt was strongly opposed to any idea of Palestinians being ethnically cleansed, pushed out into the Sinai Peninsula, but it has begun building an enclosed area ringed with high concrete walls along its borders with Gaza. So after being staunchly opposed, it seems Sisi is coming around to the idea of having some number of Palestinians in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula. So why this U-turn, if it is a U-turn? Well, what's happened over the last couple of days for Sisi to bow down to Israeli demands here?
Well, I think we have to be a little cautious in assessing Egyptian policy and intentions. At the formal official level, Egypt remains as strongly opposed to the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip as it has been from the outset. Now, what we don't know is, have there been certain arrangements made between Israel, Egypt, and Israel's sponsor, the United States, to basically open the border and force Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip and into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, probably with a Israeli-American promise that is just waiting to be violated, that this will be temporary, and once Israel completes its military operation in Rafah, these people will be allowed back. Or to the contrary, has there been no arrangement, but has the Egyptian government been reading the writing on the wall and taking, let's say, precautionary measures and establishing this kind of zone abutting the Egyptian-Palestinian border, so that if and when large numbers of Palestinians begin entering Egyptian territory, that they are essentially concentrated into one particular territorial zone, which from Egypt's perspective, on the one hand, makes this population easier to control, and secondly, will make it easier to ensure their return to the Gaza Strip at a later date.
And this, of course, has all kinds of implications if Egypt was to allow Palestinians in. I think this is a subject we'll be talking about in the next couple of shows as well.
Yes, well, if I can just interrupt to say, it may well be the case that Egypt has concluded that the situation is no longer whether Egypt will or will not allow these Palestinians to enter Egypt through the border, but that conditions on the ground will simply create a mass wave of refugees entering Egypt, whether the Egyptian authorities approve of it or not.
And I think many analysts predicted this right from the outset, from what I recall. I mean, having followed this conflict for so many years, I myself, my instinct was to say this is, of course, another ethnic cleansing. And initially, having failed to push the Palestinians out into Sinai, the goal was always to create conditions where Egypt would be forced. It would have no option other than to allow Palestinians into the Sinai Peninsula. And that's how it seems to be going.
Well, that's
But
one scenario, that Egypt will feel itself left with no choice but to allow these people entry into Egyptian territory on the basis of desperate humanitarian circumstances, although one could argue equally that Egypt has an alternative, which is simply to open the border in both directions and allow sufficient quantities of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip rather than remaining restricted by Israeli and American European policy, which is basically to starve the Palestinians into submission, create conditions of famine, and so on. That's one option. The other option is that conditions on the ground will become so desperate that Palestinians will essentially break through the border. And that would be something that would be unrelated to any Egyptian policy decision.
Let's turn our attention to another question, again related to Gaza and the humanitarian situation there.
Huh.
Every week, we've been hearing about division between Washington and Tel Aviv. And just this week, there was this incredible report of an Israeli minister blocking US-funded flour shipments, of all things, to Gaza because it was being delivered to UNRWA. So some commentators have described the White House having to basically plead with one of its largest recipients of military aid to get shipments of flour delivered to Gaza as a real, and I quote, "Who's the effing superpower here?" moment. You know, who's taking the shots here? If Israel can prevent American government from trying to send flour, it's a shocking indictment of the relationship between the two. So are you shocked by this level of disregard for Washington in Tel Aviv,
No.
especially in a week, in a week where US senators just last week approved a further 14 billion of support to Israeli military?
No, I'm not surprised at all because the U.S. has over the years almost routinely had various policy differences with Israel over this, that, and the other. But there is a fundamental policy principle in the US, which is that Israel has impunity and Israel will never suffer consequences for any action it takes, whether those actions are consistent with US policy, whether they violate US policy, whether they undermine US policy. So as long as that foundational principle of US-Israeli relations remains in place, impunity, no consequences ever, I'm not surprised that Israeli decision makers feel they have the confidence to simply flout Washington's will, do as they please, again, in the full knowledge there's no consequences. They're going to get away with it. I think the only time, really, we've ever seen these differences become a serious policy issue is, for example, when Israel has sought to export weapons that include US military technology to China. And the US threatened significant consequences for Israeli arms exporters or something, if I recall correctly, during the 1990s. But that is, let's say, that is an issue of geopolitical strategic significance to the US. But when it comes to the Palestinians, the US may have very different policy preferences, but it's understood by all concerned. Israel can do as it pleases. Israel need not pay any heed whatsoever to any preferences coming out of Washington, because at the end of the day, Israel has the full, unqualified, uncritical, unconditional support of Washington, including undermining U.S. policy. It's a fundamental principle of U.S. foreign policy, and it's not going to change.
I think that this shocking contradiction was highlighted in a Wall Street Journal page, the newspaper in the US. So on the top, you have the headline, "Biden presses Netanyahu to accept Washington's plan." And right underneath, it had another headline, "US is preparing to send bombs to arm Israel." I mean, I can't really show you here, but it's exactly, the two headlines were right next to each other. It's quite a shocking illustration of the contradictions there.
I mean, it's the spoiled child being rewarded, with an ever larger bag of candy for every tantrum it throws. Again, that's here. That it's how this relationship has operated since at least the late 1960s, and it is how it will continue to operate. You violate our policy, you will be rewarded. You undermine our policy, we will ensure there's no Security Council resolution. You use the weapons we supply you to commit genocide, and you reject any of our meek appeals to reduce the number of children you're slaughtering. No worries, you'll get even more weapons to do more of the same.
And the threat of ground invasion has prompted response from the International Court of Justice. Bear in mind, I think this month, Israel has to issue a report highlighting or demonstrating how it's implemented the provisional measures. Do you think Friday's statement, let me just say what they said in the statement. First of all, they said the situation is perilous, and they demanded an immediate implementation of the provisional measures issued last month in January, and repeated Israel's obligation to uphold its duties under the Genocide Convention. So looking ahead to later this month, do you think the Friday's press release by the ICJ is an early indication that the World Court believes Israel has failed to meet its obligation?
That's certainly the way it appears, though with these kinds of issues, I think it's probably wise not to read too deeply into the tea leaves. I will say I wasn't particularly surprised by the ICJ's decision in response to this additional request from South Africa, because it was less than a month ago that the court issued its ruling and ordered a number of provisional measures. And as I'm sure you recall, those provisional measures, unsurprisingly, did not include a call for a immediate or comprehensive ceasefire, very much in line with how the court has responded to previous cases brought before it under the Genocide Convention. And so I think it would have been, regardless of the escalating situation and the growing emergency, I think it would have nevertheless been somewhat out of character for the court to have only weeks ago chosen not to adopt a ceasefire, to now take a position on a specific military operation in a specific location. So I wouldn't be too alarmed by the court's failure to do that. I don't think this in any way shows that the court has decided to adopt the Israeli narrative, as a number of Israel's apologists and flunkies have tried to suggest. And as you say, I think what we really need to look at is the Israeli report, which will be submitted to the court, I believe, on the 26th of February. South Africa will have a opportunity to respond to that report, and the court will then give its own assessment, which may or may not include additional provisional measures, include an assessment about Israel's failure to already observe and respect the rulings that were issued last month.
And I should add for viewers and listeners, today or Monday, there was the hearing about the illegality of Israel's occupation in the West Bank started. And I think next week we'll know more about the details, and we'll hope to cover the discussions and the proceedings from that in our conversation next week. But because it started just on Monday, we will leave that aside for now.
Sure.
Moving on to another topic from last week, there's a lot of discussion about two-state solution, as though Washington and London can wish that into existence, and that's how it's been presented. But the government itself has unsurprisingly unanimously rejected the idea of a two-state solution, including Benny Gantz, who's probably one of
Great white hope.
Yeah, great hope of the West. to take over from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
לאור הדיבורים שנשמעים לאחרונה בקהילה הבינלאומית על ניסיון לכפות על ישראל באופן חד-צדדי מדינה פלסטינית, אני מביא היום לאישור הממשלה החלטה הצהרתית בנושא הזה. אני בטוח שהיא תזכה להסכמה רחבה מאוד. הנה ההצהרה. ישראל דוחה על הסף תכתיבים בינלאומיים בעניין הסדר הקבע עם הפלסטינים. הסדר כזה יושג אך ורק במשא ומתן ישיר בין הצדדים, ללא תנאים מוקדמים. ישראל תוסיף להתנגד להכרה חד-צדדית במדינה פלסטינית.
I mean, the question is Washington and other allies of Israel, are they willfully ignoring the fact that this is not a Netanyahu problem? This is much, much more entrenched and deep within Israeli society.
Look, this is really at heart an exercise in smoke and mirrors. There's a genocide going on in the Gaza Strip. There's an intensification of illegal settlement and ethnic cleansing and so on in the West Bank. And now there's a deliberate attempt to start a religious war in Jerusalem as well by the Israeli government. And to kind of ignore all of that, including even, letting Israel, as you just mentioned, prevent the delivery of desperately needed flour to the Gaza Strip, and start talking about, two-state settlement, political resolution. And then you have, of all people, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken come out in Munich and say, actually, his conclusion of what's happened in the Middle East in the last few months is that Arab states are now virtually unanimously desperate to normalize relations with Israel. I mean, how out of touch with reality can you be to think that the direction of travel is heading towards greater greater Arab acceptance of Israel by those states that do not yet have relations with it, as opposed to those relations that do exist, for example, between Israel and Jordan, coming under increasing and increasingly intense pressure. I mean, one need only look at the statements made by Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman al-Safadi in recent days. So it's really an exercise in smoke and mirrors. It's a diversionary charade. But as you noted, I think we need to bear in mind that this was not a decision forced on Netanyahu by Ben Gvir and Smotrich. This was not a decision forced on Benny Gantz by Netanyahu. This was the unanimous position of the Israeli government. And we need to bear in mind, I think, if we go back to Oslo in 1993, many people view Oslo as a framework for a two-state settlement, and one that failed because of either Israeli or Palestinian or Israeli and Palestinian policies. Well, no, a Palestinian state, an end to occupation, Palestinian self-determination, an end to illegal Israeli settlement activity. These are issues that are never mentioned in Oslo. Oslo was never intended to end the occupation and produce an independent Palestinian state. And more importantly, once that rather fraudulent diplomatic process broke down at the turn of the century, Israel reverted once again to unilateralism. In other words, that the issues in dispute between Israel and the Palestinians will be decided not through negotiations, even negotiations held under the exclusive auspices of Israel's lawyer, the United States, but rather these issues will be resolved on the basis of naked force and power unilaterally by Israel. And so if you don't need a negotiating partner and you don't need a Palestinian entity, then of course you're going to get a unanimous Israeli government decision against the Palestinian state. And I should add, Israel's previous government, which was somehow viewed as centrist and peace-loving and all the rest of it, was equally opposed to a Palestinian state. So it's another one of these issues which, for Western decision makers and commentators, is very easy to kind of ascribe to the extreme right of the Israeli political spectrum, ignoring that this position expresses a very deeply held Israeli political consensus. Given the way that Israel has now categorically rejected Palestinian statehood, I would expect the US and the EU to probably jointly nominate Netanyahu for the Nobel Peace Prize. They're not, for them, okay, this is what we would like. If you don't like it, no problem. Do as you wish, but please understand there will never be consequences for what you do.
Yeah, I think we should dedicate one program to dive deep into the two-state solution and the gap between the rights of the Palestinians and what's being offered to them as really crumbs of a state. So I think we can have that discussion as this debate moves on the global scene. So we'll do that.
I think that would be excellent, but I would like to say there is no debate currently about these issues. I would like to emphasize, I think to even raise these issues in current circumstances, it's not a discussion about the feasibility or desirability or practicality of a two-state settlement or any other political resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is at heart a diversionary charade, smoke and mirrors, so that we begin talking about these nonsensical issues rather than what is actually happening on the ground in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, including now in East Jerusalem as well.
You mentioned earlier that some of the far-right extremist members of Netanyahu's government are trying to spark a religious war in the West Bank. This week, Ben Gvir, one of the members of Netanyahu's cabinet, he's drafting a plan to prevent Palestinian Muslims from praying in Masjid al-Aqsa during Ramadan. I mean, how worried should we be about that? I mean, it's such a extreme measure to take given what's happening right now.
Well, I think the US and EU will probably give Ben Gvir their freedom of worship prize for the year. But basically, what has happened is that Itar Ben Gvir, who, in addition to being a far-right member of Israel's government, is also Israel's national security minister, and together with others in the government, looks at apocalyptic escalation as a strategic objective, and I use that term advisedly, has concocted this proposal to basically very significantly restrict the access of Palestinian Muslims to the Haram al-Sharif and the Al-Aqsa Mosque during the month of Ramadan. I should point out that this is a directive that applies not only to Palestinians from the occupied territories, but also to Palestinian Muslim citizens of Israel. In other words, this is a decree that will be imposed on Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. And again, it will be very easy to say, oh, this has Ben Gvir being a radical extremist. But the fact of the matter is that this policy has now been officially adopted by the Israeli government. It may serve Netanyahu's interests to hide behind Ben Gvir, because one thing in the West, whenever Israel comes out with another extremist initiative, you see Western politicians begin making their calculations about Israeli coalition politics, and oh, well, you have to understand the prime minister has to accommodate his radical right to stay in power and so on, as if there are no principles at stake here. But this is now official government policy. And I'm sure they will find a way to dress it up as a security measure. Washington, London, and Brussels will say, nothing is more holy than Israeli security. And of course, we understand and support Israel's right of self-defense. But I think what is happening here is a transparent attempt to escalate, to increase religious tensions at what is perhaps the most sensitive time in the Muslim calendar, and essentially to seek to spark a religious conflict between Palestinian Muslims specifically and the Israeli state. And if it works and there is a conflagration and so on, then Israel can mobilize that to impose even further restrictions on the Haram al-Sharif, on Palestinian access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and on Palestinians in the occupied territories and within Israel more generally. It's so absolutely transparent what is happening here. But again, I would like to emphasize there will be no consequences.
And one of the things that's been so vivid and clear is the PA and how ineffective it's been throughout, well, for decades now, more so over the last 4 or 5 months. But in the midst of all that, Norway says it will help facilitate the transfer of tax revenues collected by Israel, and it will be sent to the Palestinian Authority in order to prevent the financial collapse of the authority.
Yes.
Why has Norway been drafted in to prop up the PA in this way?
Well, again, this goes back to an issue I've raised repeatedly in our discussion today, which is Israeli impunity is sacred. There will be no consequences for Israel's violations of any of its treaty obligations. Not only that, the West will actively assist Israel in doing so. So let's take a step back. In 1967, when Israel first occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, it imposed an enforced common market on these territories. In other words, tax rates, VAT, import duties, and so on were identical in Israel and the occupied territories. The Israeli Central Bank, the Israeli Finance Ministry, and so on would take decisions about import duties and tax rates on a basis that best served the Israeli economy and would then impose them on the Palestinians in the occupied territories. It was very easy for Israel to do so because it had full control of the borders and the territories themselves. Along came Oslo in 1993. Israel was very keen to maintain this enforced common market. And in 1994, Israel and the PLO reached an agreement known as the Paris Protocol, whereby the Palestinians would continue to observe Israeli policy on issues such as import duties, VAT, and so on. Israel, through its control of borders, would collect all these duties and taxes, Palestinian duties and taxes, but Israel would collect them. And at the end of every month, Israel would transfer the monies it had collected to the PA. In other words, Israel was collecting Palestinian taxes and fees, and at the end of every month, transferring them to the PA minus an administrative fee of 3%, I think. Money, of course, is power, and it was during Netanyahu's first government, which took office in 1996, that Israel discovered that it could withhold these monthly transfers to exercise political pressure on the Palestinian Authority. The first time it did so, the European Union sprung into action and began transferring the amount that was withheld by Israel directly to the Palestinian Authority, because I think also needs to point, I think it's also worth pointing out that these funds constitute some 70% of the Palestinian Authority budget. In other words, these funds are essential to paying Palestinian Authority civil servants, security forces, maintaining its services to the population, and so on. So when this first happened in the 90s, the European Union rather than punishing Israel, rather than forcing Israel to comply with its treaty obligations and transfer the monies, it was the Palestinian monies that it was illegally withholding and forcing it to transfer them to the Palestinian Authority, made good the difference by essentially giving the Palestinian Authority a loan equal to the amounts that were being withheld by Israel. This was at the time lauded as essential to saving the PA from bankruptcy. Well, it did save the PA from bankruptcy, but it set a precedent that Israel is free to violate its treaty obligations, that Israel will face no consequences for violating its treaty obligations, and that Israel's Western sponsors, in this case the EU, will foot the bill for Israel's violation of its treaty obligations. If we fast forward now to late 2023, and well, before doing so Israel has over the years repeatedly withheld, using one pretext or another, Palestinian funds and refused to transfer them to the Palestinian Authority, again, always with Western support or acquiescence, never with any consequences for its violation of its treaty obligations. On October 7th, 2023, the day of the Hamas attacks on southern Israel, Israel's finance minister, the self-proclaimed fascist, Bezalel Smotrich, said that he would refuse to transfer any further tax receipts to the Palestinian Authority. Again, Palestinian monies that Israel, at Israel's own insistence, had collected on the PA's behalf. This went on for a few months. You know, the Americans and the Europeans began begging the Israelis to resume the transfer of these funds. And at one point in a discussion between either Biden or Blinken or Netanyahu, Netanyahu proposed that Israel would transfer only 70% of the funds that it had collected on the Palestinians' behalf to the Palestinian Authority. So several years ago, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas reached an agreement whereby the Palestinian Authority would use approximately 30% of the funds transferred to the PA by Israel on a monthly basis to pay the salaries of civil servants in Gaza, to pay public utility bills and so on the principle that these were monies Israel had collected on the basis of economic activity concerning the Gaza Strip. So Netanyahu's proposal was the 70% that we've collected from the West Bank, we will transfer to the PA. The remaining 30% that we've collected from the Gaza Strip, we will transfer to Norway, and Norway will basically put them in escrow until a solution is found for them. Palestinian Authority's initial position was, this is our money. You either transfer all of it or none of it. And if you transfer none of it, there's going to be a real crisis, because if the PA can't pay its civil servants and security forces, there's going to be a breakdown in law and order in the West Bank. And what Norway has essentially done is it has agreed to take custody of that 30% of this monthly budget, to keep it in Norway, and to only spend it if it acquires approval for the disbursement of that fund from Israel's Ministry of Finance. In other words, from the self-proclaimed far-right fascist Bezalel Smotrich. Now, the Israeli security establishment was desperate to find a solution to this problem as well, because they saw the consequences of many thousands of Palestinian security forces not getting their monthly salaries. So rather than telling Israel, you either fulfill your treaty obligations, and if you don't, there's going to be a very serious breakdown in law and order in the West Bank, and the first victim of this is going to be the Israeli military and the Israeli settlements. Rather than doing that, the West has essentially allowed Israel to evade its treaty obligations, has stepped in to foot the bill for Israel's evasion of its treaty obligations, and has ensured that Israel enjoys total impunity in evading its treaty obligations. Now, I'm sure the Norwegians and the Americans feel they've saved the PA from bankruptcy, which they have. And the PA, I suspect, is also at some level satisfied with this arrangement because it was really between a rock and a hard place. The alternative to agreeing to this deal would have been bankruptcy. But once again, I think the larger picture here is that Israel is allowed to do as it pleases. And when it creates a problem that was identified chiefly by the Israeli security establishment, rather than Israel being told to get with the program and fulfill its treaty obligations or else suffer the consequences, what we have here is Norway stepping in to save Israel from itself.
I think that background is useful. I know you spoke at length, but a lot of people don't understand how it is that Israel ended up with, collecting Palestinian taxes, why that arrangement came about. And the more I look at that, I mean, it's just another example of how Israel extracts concessions from the Palestinians using Palestinian rights. It's their rights, but Israel uses that to extract more and more concessions from the Palestinians.
And it can only do so because it has the full support of the Americans and the Europeans. If the Americans and the Europeans would tell Israel, your impunity does not extend to this issue, it would have been solved from the outset.
Yeah, let's turn our attention to the region. There's been a lot of bombing in southern Gaza. So southern Lebanon. So
Yeah.
Israel's attack on southern Lebanon have intensified, reaching a peak, I think it was on Wednesday. One former head of Human Rights Watch in Beirut said that Israel is trying to make southern Lebanon uninhabitable for civilians and create a security buffer zone. Is that the real aim, do you think? Does Israel want to create a buffer zone in southern Lebanon? And is that what explains the escalation in bombing and raids into southern Lebanon?
Well, I think by way of background, that Israel is still nursing its wounds from its inability to achieve anything in Lebanon in 2006, when it went in with very similar bravado as it did into Gaza, saying basically we're going to wipe out Hezbollah, this organization will no longer exist, and so on. And what we have now is Hezbollah many times stronger today than it was in 2006. On October 8th, Hezbollah began conducting a series of attacks on Israeli targets, initially within occupied areas of southern Lebanon, in solidarity with the Palestinians and to relieve the pressure on the Palestinians. And Israel essentially has decided that it wants to solve its Lebanon problem as well. The only problem is it doesn't have the power to do so. The Israelis keep threatening that they can make Beirut look like Gaza, that they can make Lebanon look like Gaza. Well, that's true, but the difference between Hamas and Hezbollah is that Hezbollah can make Tel Aviv look like Gaza as well, and that Hezbollah or southern Lebanon is not, let's say, encaged the way that the Gaza Strip is. What we're now seeing is a very deliberate, I think, escalation of the conflict against Lebanon by the Israeli Air Force. Today, for example, they hit just outside of Sidon, far north of where they had been operating previously. And what we're seeing is this consistent, gradual escalation that appears to be heading very much towards a full-scale confrontation between Israel and Lebanon.
Let's end on a global topic. Again, it's to do with the US. Throughout the week, we've heard reports about strong disagreements between Netanyahu and Biden. One source said that Biden had used expletives to describe Netanyahu. I'm not going to say what they were. Yet Washington is now threatening to veto a Gaza ceasefire resolution put forward by Algeria at the UN Security Council. We spoke earlier about Washington pleading to Israel to allow flour into Gaza. But the question many would ask is if the alleged disagreements are as strong as it's reported, why doesn't Washington just use its leverage? In this case, say that it will not veto a ceasefire resolution drafted by Algeria or anyone else. I mean, why wouldn't it even do that if there was such a strong disagreement between who many describe as Genocide Joe and Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, with enemies like this, who needs friends, right?
Yeah.
I think, I think it's important to recognize several issues here. First of all, the U.S., despite any differences it may have with Israel, remains deeply invested in an Israeli victory. I think its main issue with Israel is Israel's inability to achieve that victory. Second of all, there is no evidence that the U.S. is supporting a ceasefire. There is no evidence that the U.S. would like a ceasefire, but is being sabotaged by Israel. And third of all, I think we also need to understand the deep, visceral, personal, and ideological identification that very senior leaders in Washington, I'm thinking of people like Biden, Blinken, McGurk, have with Israel. They don't distinguish between American interests and Israeli interests. From their point of view, what is good for Israel is good for the United States. Any Israeli failure or disadvantage will have a negative impact on the US and its regional and geopolitical position. So the identity is complete. They're incapable of really distinguishing between the two. I think that plays a much bigger role than considerations about being funded by pro-Israeli billionaires or the influence of the Israel lobby in Washington or any of that. But again, I think in addition to that, Biden apparently has this principle that for the US to preserve its influence with Israel, there can never be any public dispute between the two countries. There could be no daylight between the US and Israel, particularly not in multilateral organizations like the United Nations. And there is, of course, a broader US principle at stake here, which is that anything to do with this file needs to be decided by the United States, not by multilateral or international organizations like the United Nations Security Council. And so I think you take all those issues together and you get exactly what you have now. Total Israeli impunity, total US support, zero consequences for Israel. And when Israel does publicly, visibly flout US policy, the response is a reward. In this case, yet another veto at the UN Security Council.
Thank you, Mouin. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. And thank you for tuning in. If you liked this episode or any of the other episodes, please like our YouTube page or any of the platform you're watching this discussion from. So I'll see you next week for another episode of Memo Review with me, Naseem Ahmed. Bye-bye.